Hello, you're listening to the Drawing the Ideal Self podcast, episode 65. Apologies if you hear background noise. I've had to have the windows open because it's so hot in the UK. Today we're going to hear what Tom Ravenette has to say about a construct and his interpretation of what Kelly was saying. I just want to give a warning that the paper's from 1985, so the language is definitely dated. We've had a few episodes where we've thought about constructs, and I guess I'm repeating those kind of things with different authors and different takes on it, so that you can get a real feel for what a construct is. The better you understand it, the more you'll be able to apply things to your own work and your own thinking, and your thinking about how you construe, and of course how the people you work with construe. So if you've listened to this podcast over time, you will know I'm a big fan of Tom Ravenette, and his book, Personal Construct Theory in Educational Psychology, A Practitioner's View, is a classic text, particularly about working with children and young people and the people who work with them, so their teachers, their parents. But also everything that you learn in this book you can apply from work with anybody. So although he talks about working with children and young people and their adults around them, you could apply that to working with people who have got all kinds of difficulties and the people around them. So I'm hoping that you'll find something useful in this book. I'd say it's really worth buying, but I think at the moment it's pretty expensive, as all major texts are. You might find it secondhand on somewhere like Amazon or eBay. This particular chapter is called Practitioners Who Work with Children, and Tom introduces it saying, a small group of personal construct theory, PCT, practitioners, all involved at some level with children, met regularly at the Personal Construct Psychology Centre in London to discuss matters of common concern. At their instigation, I prepared this paper for the centre. It turned out to be a rather formal statement of PCT, albeit somewhat rearranged in a structure that reflected my own overview of the theory, specifically directed to working with people working with children. So Tom says, 2 fundamental principles form the roots of the psychology of personal constructs. The first is described by Kelly as the principle of constructive alternativism, which states very simply that whatever view of things might currently be held, it is always possible to construct an alternative. Developments in the various branches of science manifest this principle on a grand scale. Variations in individuals' knowing manifest this at a personal level. Variations in individuals' knowings manifest this at a personal level. It is the awareness that alternative views can be constructed that leads to the hope and expectation for changes in behaviour, as alternative views offer the prospect of alternative actions. This principle, therefore, underlies the aims of practice. The second fundamental principle rests on the fact that all knowing stems from the awareness of differences, and by implication, their complement, sameness. A difference is known by the impact that it makes. The awareness of difference is in the perceiver and is, therefore, personal to him. For Kelly, this principle leads to the formulation of the construct as the central concept of the theory, but the implications of the construct as a concept are seldom fully appreciated. Some of them are presented in the following observations. And here he gives a list of 13 observations on constructs. 1. The construct is an abstraction that 2. Arises from an awareness of similarity and a contrast between events. 3. And is therefore bipolar. 4. This awareness will have cognitive, affective and conative aspects. 5. The construct arises out of an individual's personal experience and is therefore his own. 6. It provides an axis for discriminating between events. 7. It has predictive properties. 8. As one construct among others, it provides an underlying basis for a person to make sense of himself and his circumstances. 9. For convenience, the abstraction may be given verbal markers, A to identify the two ends, B for distinguishing one construct from others, and C for communication. 10. If a person takes another person's verbal markers as the basis for a construct, he will invest it with his own personal meanings. 11. Because awareness of differences occurs from the earliest moments of an infant's life, there will be constructs for which no verbal markers will be available. These can be called pre-verbal constructs. 12. Because of the essential continuity of human development, constructs with verbal markers may have origins in pre-verbal experiences. And 13. A personal system of constructs, as defined, provides the underlying basis whereby he constructs his map of reality. It is not, however, the map, nor is it reality. The construct, therefore, operates at a low level of awareness and is not directly observable. He goes on to say, a person's behaviour is made up from the choices he makes from moment to moment. These will always be in the direction of making the world, both internal and external, more predictable, more interesting, more bearable, or whatever he senses to further his own best interest. For Kelly, the metaphor is that behaviour is an experiment. That last statement reminds us that when we're watching somebody behave, we can't see their constructs. We might see what they do, but we don't know the meaning of it. I think this is very important if you're in a role that requires you to observe the behaviour of children or some other people and interpret that behaviour or make sense of it using your own construction system. So quite often in the practice of an educational psychologist, they might do an observation in a classroom, watching a particular child to see how well they're interacting in the class and to see how much time they're spending doing their work or doing other things. And that's some kind of proxy about engagement. However, what that doesn't do is tell you anything about what the child thinks they're doing, what sense they make of their own behaviour, what sense they make of the context that they're in. So in order to find that out, there's no way round having to interview the child. So personally, when I was an educational psychologist, I would tend to interview the child instead of do the observation, because I could find out more useful things that way. And finally, Tom goes on to say, problems arise when a person's constructions fail to give meaning to oncoming events, or when anticipations are consistently invalidated, or when, as between individuals, there exist serious mismatches in their construction of the same events, in particular where there is radical mismatch between a person's own construction of himself and the constructions others have of him. It follows from these observations that there are important implications for the practitioner. The first is that he must honour the fact that individuals interpret the world in ways which are entirely their own. And secondly, when problems arise, the individual's personal interpretation, although honoured, should not, therefore, go unchallenged. Personal construct theory, by placing its emphasis on a person's construction of the world and by stressing the essentially active nature of man, points the need for change of construction as a basis of change in behaviour, and the way of action as a means for bringing this about. Intervention, therefore, requires that the practitioner takes a careful account of the client's existing construction of his world, but also poses to his client the question: if your current behaviour represents the best solution for you at the moment, what are the alternatives you are rejecting, and in what ways do those alternatives offer you a disservice? The task for the practitioner is to help the client find ways in which he may revise his constructions or his construction systems. This may be fostered by exploring with him reflectively, either at the surface or profound level, his constructions of his inner or outer worlds, his self-identity, or the identity of others. More actively, he may be directed to play a role whereby he is in the position of receiving a different range of validatory information. This is the experimental way. So here Tom's emphasising the link between the experimental approach in PCP and the understanding of a person's construing. And everything that you would do in an interview is an experiment. Your conversation with a person, you don't know how it's going to go, you don't know where it's going to go, and I do think that sometimes that really puts practitioners off. They'd like to have either a set of questions pre-prescribed so that they can work through them, or they want to have, I suppose, the possible answers even for some sorts of things. But an interview that's supposed to lead to what I think Tom would have called illumination. So, a different view on a problem or an aspect of a problem that you haven't looked at before that suddenly you can see. You can't have a fixed set or way of doing that because it needs to be tailored to the person that you're talking to, whether that's a child or an adult. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there with that. And if you're doing a personal construct psychology course, you may or may not have come across Tom Ravenette. I would hope so, because really he's one of the key authors for working with children and young people and teachers and schools. And I'm hoping all of you have not got too hot and sweaty when you're listening to this. Maybe you're listening to it in the middle of winter. That's really quite a funny idea. Anyway, I will talk to you again next month. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.